The galactic archive on Station Verath 9 was not built for beauty. It was built for preservation, a massive angular structure of neutron-compressed alloy that hung in the dead space between 3 solar systems, answering to no single government, belonging to no single species. It was, by design, the most neutral place in the known galaxy, a cathedral of knowledge without faith, without allegiance, without warmth. 14 billion linguistic files hummed inside its crystalline storage arrays, each one a perfect snapshot of how a species thought, dreamed, argued, and mourned. The Silthine harmonic language occupied an entire wing, its tonal structures so complex that the storage medium itself vibrated faintly, producing a sound that maintenance crews described as almost sad. The Dreven combat tongue was stored in a shielded vault, not because it was dangerous, but because its rigid phonetic frequencies interfered with nearby data cores. The Avathi mathematical language was the smallest file in the archive, elegant and compressed, requiring less storage than a single human children's book. And then there was Vault 7. It sat at the lowest level of the station, beneath the main archive floors, beneath the maintenance corridors, beneath even the recycling systems that processed the station's waste. Someone had gone to considerable effort to put it as far from everything else as structurally possible. The corridor leading to it was unlit, not broken, but deliberately deactivated. Visitors were meant to feel the darkness pressing against them as they approached. They were meant to hesitate. 3 psionic dampening fields surrounded the vault in concentric layers. The first neutralized surface-level telepathic contact. The second severed deeper empathic connections. The third, a classified Silthine design that the Conquered had never used anywhere else, created what psionics experts called a dead zone. A space where thought itself felt heavier, slower, as if the air had opinions about what you were allowed to think. Commander Vostral of Station Security had overseen Vault 7 for 19 years. In that time, he had processed exactly 4 access requests. The first 3 had been denied unanimously by the Conquered ambassadors. The fourth, Drenvalis's request, had taken 11 years of bureaucratic warfare before a narrow, contentious vote had granted conditional approval. Vostral did not like it. He stood now in the unlit corridor, his massive Dreven frame blocking most of the passage, watching the young Avathi researcher approach with that unmistakable glow of academic excitement. Amber and violet flickered across Drenvalis's translucent skin like a debate between caution and curiosity, and Vostral had been alive long enough to know which one always won with scientists. "You've read the full briefing?" Vostral asked, his deep voice resonating off the metal walls. "3 times, Drenvalis replied, his tone carrying the clipped efficiency of someone who considered the question beneath him. "Then you've read what happened to Kethphora?" A pause, the violet dimmed slightly. Ambassador Kethphora experienced a psychological event that was never properly diagnosed. Her report was anecdotal, not scientific. The Conquered's response was, "She tore off her diplomatic sash," Vostral interrupted, "in front of the full Conquered assembly. 400 years of service, and she threw it on the floor like it was garbage. Then she looked at the Silthine High Consul, her own superior, and said in fluent Terran English, 'None of this matters the way I thought it did.'" Drenvalis blinked all 4 of his eyes, one pair at a time. "I am aware of the incident. She requested asylum on Earth. Did you know that? A Silthine ambassador, one of the most respected diplomats in the Conquered, begged to live among humans, said she couldn't go back to speaking Silthine full-time, said it felt like..." Vostral's mandibles worked silently for a moment, searching for the translation. "Like seeing in color and being asked to return to gray." The corridor was silent, except for the faint hum of the dampening fields. 48 hours, Vostral said finally, stepping aside. "Not a minute more." Drenvalis nodded and walked forward into the dark. Behind him, Vostral watched the small, glowing figure disappear toward the vault door, and for reasons he could not explain and did not enjoy, he felt something unfamiliar tighten in his chest. Something that, had he known the word, he might have called worry. The vault door sealed behind him with a sound like a breath being held. No echo, no resonance, just silence so complete that Drenvalis could hear the fluid circulating through his own cranial membranes, a wet, rhythmic whisper that suddenly seemed impossibly loud. The room was smaller than he had expected. The intelligence briefings had described it as a containment chamber, which conjured images of vast, sterile laboratories with observation galleries and emergency protocols. The reality was a 6-meter cube of featureless gray alloy, empty except for the crystalline data core suspended in the center by an invisible magnetic cradle. It was beautiful. The core was roughly the size of a Avathi head, multifaceted, turning slowly in the dead air with the lazy confidence of something that knew it was the most important object in the room. Light moved inside it, not reflected, but generated. Patterns of quantum luminescence drifted through its interior like thoughts made visible, shifting between colors that Drenvali's species could perceive and colors that existed just beyond the edge of his visual range, teasing him with the suggestion of something more. He set up his equipment with the careful precision of a researcher who had spent 11 years preparing for this moment. Datapad synced to his neural interface, recording algorithms active, emotional baseline calibrated, cognitive drift monitors online, everything by the book, everything controlled. He placed his palm on the core, and control became a memory. The first thing he felt was not a word but a sensation, a vibration that began in his fingertips and traveled up through his arm, across his shoulder, and into the base of his skull where Avathi language processing occurred. It felt like someone had struck a tuning fork against the inside of his mind. Not painful, not unpleasant, just present in a way that nothing had ever been present before. Then came hope. It did not arrive as a definition. It did not present itself as a concept to be analyzed, categorized, and filed alongside the thousands of other alien words Drenvalis had studied. It arrived as an experience, a memory that was not his own, but felt more real than anything he had ever personally lived. He was standing in a field of dry, cracked earth. The sky above was choked with smoke, not the clean industrial emissions of a spacefaring civilization, but the thick, acrid smoke of something organic burning. Crops, homes, lives. The air tasted like ash and failure, and the ground beneath his feet had not produced food in 2 growing seasons. He was starving. His body, a human body he realized with distant shock, was consuming itself. Muscles had withered. Ribs pressed against skin like the bars of a cage. Every breath was a negotiation between lungs that wanted to quit and a brain that refused to let them. And yet, he was looking at the horizon. Specifically, he was looking at a thin line of gray cloud building in the east, the kind that might carry rain. Not certainly, not even probably, just possibly. And that possibility, that slender thread of maybe, was enough to keep him standing in a dead field on legs that had every biological reason to collapse. That was hope. Not optimism. Optimism was a calculation, a weighing of probabilities that favored a positive outcome. Hope was what remained when the probabilities had been weighed and found catastrophic. It was the irrational, indefensible, magnificent decision to keep standing anyway. Drenvalis gasped and pulled his hand from the core. He stumbled backward 3 steps, his skin blazing white, his 4 eyes wide and streaming with fluid he didn't know he could produce. His datapad was beeping urgently, cognitive drift monitors showing readings so far beyond normal parameters that the algorithms had flagged a potential psychotic break. He was not having a psychotic break. He was having an awakening. For 200 years, the Avathi scholarly collective had debated a theoretical question. Could a language carry emotional weight beyond its semantic content? The dominant position, the one Drenvalis himself had defended in 6 published papers, was no. Language was a delivery system for meaning. It was a vehicle, not a passenger. The words themselves were neutral containers, shaped by culture but ultimately reducible to information. He had been spectacularly, beautifully, terrifyingly wrong. Human words were not containers. They were living things, organisms built from centuries of collective experience, carrying inside them the compressed emotional history of every being who had ever spoken them. The word hope did not describe an abstract concept. It contained within its 4 letters the memory of every drought survived, every illness beaten, every war endured, every dawn that followed a night someone thought would never end. He reached for the core again. His hand was shaking. His cognitive drift monitors were screaming. He touched it anyway. Because something in him, something that had not existed 10 minutes ago, whispered that this was what humans would do. And the word defiance crashed into him like a star being born. By hour 6, the datapad had run out of warning categories. It had cycled through cognitive anomaly, emotional surge, neural restructuring detected, and identity coherence at risk before finally settling on a flashing red symbol that simply meant unknown state. Drenvali's had turned it face down on the floor an hour ago. The numbers it was producing were meaningless now. You could not measure what was happening to him with instruments built by a species that had never felt this way. He sat with his back against the vault wall, the data core still spinning lazily above him, feeding him language in waves that came not through his palm anymore but through the air itself, as though the file had learned how he listened and adjusted its delivery. Each wave brought words, and each word brought ghosts. The word disaster, bad star, disastro. He rolled it through his mind and felt the ancient terror beneath it, a species that had looked up at the night sky and seen not wonder but judgment. Comets meant plague. Eclipses meant the death of kings. The stars were not destinations to the earliest humans. They were verdicts. And humans had lived beneath those verdicts for millennia, planting crops and building cities and raising children under a sky they believed was actively deciding whether to destroy them. And they had done it anyway. That was the part that kept breaking him, not the fear, every species knew fear, but the continuation, the insane, glorious refusal to stop building things beneath a sky that might crush them. The Avathi would have calculated the risk and retreated underground. The Dreven would have declared war on the sky itself and died gloriously. The Silthine would have composed a harmonic elegy and accepted their fate with grace. Humans built irrigation systems. They invented mathematics to predict the floods that killed their children. They charted the stars that terrified them and used those charts to navigate. They took the instruments of their terror and turned them into tools of liberation. The word goodbye settled into him next, and it arrived wearing centuries like a tattered coat. God be with you. 4 words compressed by 10,000 daily departures into 2 syllables and a wave of the hand. Drenvali's felt the compression, felt the way humans wore down their most sacred concepts through sheer repetitive use, like river water smoothing stone. It was not carelessness, it was intimacy. Humans used their holiest words so often that the words became part of their breathing. They did not set their prayers on altars and visit them on ceremonial days. They carried them in their mouths, between their teeth, woven into the mundane fabric of leaving a room or ending a communication. The sacred was not separate from the ordinary. It was the ordinary. Every goodbye was a tiny prayer, spoken so automatically that the speaker had forgotten they were praying. But the prayer was still there, buried in the syllables like a seed in dry earth, waiting. And then the file gave him something that stopped his breathing entirely. I'm fine. 2 words, 7 letters, the most sophisticated lie in the known galaxy. It arrived not as a single experience, but as a chorus, thousands of voices, millions, all speaking at once. A mother with bruises hidden beneath long sleeves, smiling at her children across a kitchen table. A soldier sitting in rubble, dust coating his face like a death mask, giving a thumbs up to his squad. A teenager in a bathroom, gripping the edges of a sink, staring at a mirror, rehearsing the words until they sounded convincing enough to survive another day of school. I'm fine, I'm fine, I'm fine. Every single one of them was lying. Every single one of them knew the other was lying. And every single one of them accepted the lie, not because they were cruel or indifferent, but because they understood something that no other species in the conquered had ever grasped. Sometimes the lie was the only bridge between a person and the abyss. Sometimes pretending to be okay was the first step toward actually becoming okay. Sometimes the fiction of strength created real strength, the way a scaffold supports a building that will eventually stand on its own. Drenvali's pressed his forehead against the cold metal wall and let the chorus wash through him. He had spent his entire career studying languages as systems, architectures of meaning, frameworks of logic, elegant machines for transmitting thought from one mind to another. He had believed, with the quiet arrogance of the highly educated, that understanding a language meant understanding the rules that governed it. Humans had no rules. They had survival strategies disguised as grammar. Every tense, every conjugation, every irregular verb was a scar from a wound the species had survived. The past tense existed because humans needed to carry their dead with them. The future tense existed because they refused to believe the dead were all that awaited them. And the present tense, that fragile, flickering, impossible to hold now, existed because humans had learned, through endless repetition of loss, that the current moment was the only thing they could actually touch. The file pulsed again, and Drenvali's realized he was no longer receiving individual words. He was receiving the spaces between them. The pause before "I love you," the silence after a diagnosis, the held breath between a question and an answer that would change everything. Humans had filled their language with silence, and the silence carried more meaning than the words themselves. No Avathi instrument could measure silence. No algorithm could quantify the weight of a pause. But Drenvalis felt it. He felt it in the spaces between his own thoughts, in the gaps between his heartbeats, in the new and terrifying emptiness that had opened up inside him where certainty used to live. The emptiness was not comfortable, but it was alive. And for the first time in his 200-year career, Drenvalis understood that alive and comfortable were not the same thing, and that humans had always known the difference. Hour 14 arrived like a tide that had been building since the moment he first touched the core. Drenvalis was packing now, 3 steps forward, 3 steps back, 3 steps forward, a rhythm his body had invented without his permission, as though his muscles had learned something his mind was still processing. The untranslatable words had begun. Every xenolinguist in the Conquered knew that untranslatables existed. They were treated as curiosities, charming little artifacts of cultural specificity like pressed flowers from alien gardens. The Silthine had 11. The Drivan had 3, all related to variations of honorable death. The Avathi had exactly 1, Prathais, the pleasure of elegant proof. It was considered a point of pride that the Avathi language was so precise, so mathematically rigorous, that almost everything could be translated perfectly into any other tongue. Humans had thousands, not dozens, not hundreds, thousands of concepts so deeply woven into their experience that no other species had ever developed the cognitive framework to hold them. And they kept making more. New untranslatables emerged from human culture every generation, every decade, sometimes every year, as though the species was perpetually discovering new rooms in the house of consciousness and immediately furnishing them with words. Saudata came first, and it nearly drove him to the floor. It was not sadness. Drenvalis knew sadness, every sentient species did. Sadness was a neurochemical response to loss, a signal from the brain that something valued had been removed. It was clean. It was functional, it had a purpose and eventually an end. Saudata had no end. It was the love that remained after the beloved was gone, not fatting, not healing, not resolving into acceptance, but persisting, growing, becoming a companion in its own right. Humans carried their absent loves inside them like organs they could not remove, and the weight of those absent loves shaped the way they walked through the world. A human experiencing Saudata was not broken. They were full of someone who was no longer there, and the fullness was simultaneously the wound and the treasure. Drenvalis had never conceived of a wound that was also a treasure. The Avathi approach to loss was surgical. Identify the damage, calculate the repair, execute the restoration. The idea that damage could be valuable, that a scar could be more beautiful than unbroken skin, was so alien to his native cognition that absorbing it felt like growing a new limb. Then came Hiraeth. Homesickness for a home that never existed. Drenvalis stopped packing when this one hit him, standing perfectly still in the center of the vault while the concept rearranged the furniture of his mind. Humans missed places they had never been. They longed for times they had never lived in. They carried inside them an image of perfection, a golden age, a lost paradise, a childhood summer that memory had polished into something no reality could match, and they grieved for it. They grieved for fictions. And the grief was real. That was the part that shattered every model Drenvalis had ever built. The emotion did not care that its object was imaginary. The tears were wet. The ache was physical. The longing shaped decisions, drove migrations, started revolutions. Humans had gone to war over imagined pasts. They had built entire political movements around returning to places that existed only in collective memory. The fiction was more powerful than fact because it was perfect, and reality, messy, complicated, disappointing reality, could never compete with perfection. And yet humans did not abandon reality. That was the impossible contradiction that made the species extraordinary. They carried their impossible dreams and lived in the imperfect world simultaneously, holding both truths in their minds without going insane. Or rather, going a little insane, in the way that all the most interesting things in the universe were a little insane. Then Mami Lapinatapai arrived, and Drenvalis understood everything. A look between two people, a shared desire, a mutual hesitation. It was not a word about love or fear or connection. It was a word about the threshold, the sacred, trembling, electrically charged instant before any of those things began. Humans had looked at the space between intention and action, the gap between wanting and doing, and they had said, "This space is holy. This moment of almost but not yet is worthy of being named." No other species had named the threshold. The Silthine moved through emotional transitions in smooth, harmonic glides, one state flowing into the next without pause. The Driven made decisions with the finality of a blade falling. There was no space between choosing and acting. The Avathi analyzed until the optimal path was clear and then followed it without hesitation. Only humans lingered. Only humans savored the doorway between what was and what could be. Only humans understood that sometimes the most beautiful part of a journey was the moment before the first step. Drenvalis sank slowly to his knees. His skin had stopped flickering entirely. It glowed that steady, nameless color, warm, deep, alive, and he realized with a shock that felt like surfacing from deep water that the color was not nameless after all. It was Saudada, it was Hiraith, it was Mami Lapinatapai. It was the color of a mind that had learned to love things it could never fully hold. And that was why the Conquered had sealed the vault, not because the language was a weapon, not because it caused madness or destabilized neural architecture or threatened political order. Because it made you bigger. And the Conquered, Drenvalis realized with a clarity that tasted like iron and starlight, was terrified of anyone getting bigger than the systems designed to contain them. Hour 20. The cognitive drift monitors had given up entirely. The datapad screen displayed a single flat line, not the flat line of death, but the flat line of an instrument that had encountered something beyond its range and simply stopped pretending it could measure it. Drenvalis barely noticed. He was too busy experiencing something his species had no biological framework for. He was laughing. The first laugh had ambushed him, a convulsive, undignified eruption from somewhere deep in his respiratory system that sounded like a Silthine percussion instrument being dropped down a stairwell. It startled him so violently that he toppled sideways off the bench, cracking his elbow against the vault floor, which somehow made him laugh harder. The data core had given him a pun. A pun, the lowest form of human wit, according to humans themselves, which was, Drenvalis was rapidly discovering, exactly the kind of contradictory nonsense that made their species impossible to categorize. They ranked their humor forms in hierarchies, and then celebrated the lowest ranks with the most enthusiasm. They called puns dad jokes and groaned at them performatively while secretly experiencing profound neurological pleasure. They had built an entire social ritual around pretending not to enjoy things they obviously enjoyed. The pun itself was simple. I used to hate facial hair, but then it grew on me. 7 words, 2 meanings. One biological impossibility treated as both a grooming preference and an emotional journey. It was, by Avathi standards, nonsensical. It communicated no useful information. It advanced no argument. It resolved no question. It was, by every metric his training had given him, a waste of cognitive resources. And it was perfect. Because the pun did something that no Avathi sentence had ever done. It made the listener's brain split. For one fraction of a second, the mind was forced to hold 2 incompatible meanings simultaneously, to exist in a state of semantic superposition where language meant 2 things at once, and the collision between those meanings produced a spark of involuntary joy. Humans had weaponized ambiguity. They had taken the very feature of their language that drove every other species to frustration, its maddening imprecision, its refusal to mean just one thing, and turned it into a delivery system for happiness. But the puns were only the surface. Beneath the wordplay lay something darker and more extraordinary. The file fed him deeper layers of human humor, and each layer revealed a new impossibility. Humans joked about death. Not abstractly, not philosophically. They joked about their own deaths with specificity and enthusiasm that would have sent a Avathi psychiatrist into professional crisis. They imagined their funerals and wrote comedy about them. They personified death as a robed skeleton and made him a character, sometimes frightening, sometimes bumbling, sometimes romantic, sometimes playing chess with a medieval knight on a beach. They had taken the one universal terror, the extinction of the self, the end of consciousness, the void, and they had given it a personality. They had looked at oblivion and said, "You're not a mystery, you're a character in our story, and in our story you can be funny." Drenvalis felt the magnitude of this, and his laughter faded into something quieter, something like reverence. Because humor, he now understood, was not entertainment for humans. It was armor. It was the psychological equivalent of the Driven exoskeleton, a hardened outer layer that allowed the soft, vulnerable interior to survive impacts that should have been fatal. Humans laughed at the things that frightened them because laughter reduced things. It shrank terrors down to manageable size. A thing you could laugh at was a thing you could survive, not defeat. Humans were under no illusion that laughter killed monsters. But it made the monsters survivable, and for a species with no claws, no venom, no natural armor, and a lifespan so short it barely registered on a galactic timescale, survivable was enough. The file showed him soldiers in trenches, caked in mud and blood, telling jokes so dark they would have been classified as psychological warfare by conquered standards. It showed him doctors in plague wards, laughing between patients because the alternative was a kind of madness that didn't come back. It showed him children in poverty inventing games from garbage, giggling with a ferocity that had nothing to do with happiness and everything to do with refusal. Refusal to be crushed, refusal to be defined by circumstance, refusal to grant the universe the satisfaction of seeing them break. There was a human tradition called gallows humor, jokes told by the condemned on their way to execution, literally standing at the threshold of death, rope around their necks, and making the executioner laugh. Drenvalis turned this concept over and over in his mind like a gemstone with too many facets to count. A species that joked on the gallows was a species that could not be fully conquered. You could take everything from them, freedom, dignity, life itself, and they would use their last breath to make a stranger smile. Not because it changed anything, not because it saved them, but because in that final, defiant moment of laughter, they were declaring something that no force in the universe could contradict. I am more than what is happening to me. Drenvalis laughed again, softer this time, warmer. It came from the new place inside him, the place that had not existed before the vault, the place that was growing larger with every human word he absorbed. He thought about Commander Vostrel standing in the dark corridor outside, mandibles clicking with professional concern. He thought about the Driven's rigid discipline, his carefully maintained emotional distance, his absolute commitment to protocol. And Drenvalis thought, I wonder what he would look like if he laughed. Not the Driven equivalent, the sharp mandible clack of tactical amusement. A real laugh. The kind that humans produced. The kind that started in the belly and climbed through the chest and erupted from the mouth like a small, joyful explosion that served no evolutionary purpose except to say, I am alive, and for this one moment that is hilarious. He wanted to hear it. He wanted to hear every species in the conquered laugh that way. Not because it would solve anything. Not because it would advance diplomatic relations or resolve territorial disputes or answer the great scientific questions of the age. But because it would mean they were free. Free from the tyranny of efficiency. Free from the prison of always being rational. Free from the cold, clean, perfectly ordered existence that every advanced civilization had built for itself, and then wondered why it felt so empty. Humans were not empty. They were the least empty beings in the galaxy. They were so full of contradictions, emotions, terrors, and delights that they overflowed constantly, spilling laughter into dark places, leaking tears into joyful ones, mixing everything together in a glorious, chaotic mess that no algorithm could predict and no institution could control. And their humor was the proof. The irrefutable, beautiful, ridiculous proof that a species could stare into the infinite darkness between the stars and say, So the void walks into a bar. Hour 30. The vault had changed temperature, not physically. The environmental systems maintained a constant 18.3 degrees standard, monitored by sensors that had not deviated in 19 years. But Drenvalis felt warmth. Real, tangible, impossible warmth, radiating from the data core like heat from a dying star that refused to go cold. His bioluminescent skin had surrendered its entire spectrum. No more amber anxiety. No more violet curiosity, no more white shock. It had settled into that nameless color, the one that pulsed with a rhythm his species did not possess, and it showed no signs of changing back. He did not want it to change back. The love words had begun, and they were dismantling him with a gentleness that felt like violence. Not the clinical terms. The file had dispensed with those quickly: romance, attraction, pair bonding, reproductive compatibility, dismissing them the way a master painter might dismiss a child's crayon. Those were the scaffolding. What came next was the cathedral. Sweetheart, The word entered him sideways, slipping past his analytical defenses like water through cracked stone. It was not a descriptor. It was not a classification. It was a renaming. When a human called another being sweetheart, they were performing an act of linguistic alchemy, taking an entire person with all their flaws and failures and contradictions and distilling them down to a single declaration. You are sweet, and you are in my heart, and those two facts are the same fact. The Avathi had no equivalent. Avathi partnerships were formalized through compatibility matrices, detailed assessments of intellectual alignment, genetic complementarity, and projected collaborative output. The process was thorough, rational, and produced stable unions with a 94.7% satisfaction rate. Humans had a 50% divorce rate in some cultures, and they kept getting married anyway. Drenvalis let that statistic wash over him and felt it reshape something fundamental in his understanding of courage. Because that was what it was, not foolishness, not irrationality, courage. Humans looked at love with full knowledge that it would probably hurt them, that the odds were essentially a coin flip between lasting happiness and devastating loss, and they chose it anyway, every single generation, every single culture, every single time. They chose it the way they chose hope, not because the math supported it, but because something in them was built to leap across chasms that logic said were too wide. Darling. This one carried age, centuries of it. The word had evolved from the Old English diorling, little dear one, and it arrived wrapped in the ghosts of every candle-lit room, every whispered conversation, every hand reaching for another hand beneath rough wool blankets in stone cottages while winter howled outside. It was a word that had survived plagues and wars and the complete transformation of the civilization that birthed it, enduring not because it was useful, but because it was needed. Humans needed their love words the way they needed oxygen, not metaphorically. The file showed him studies, human scientists studying their own species with the same clinical detachment that Drenvalis had once prided himself on, demonstrating that prolonged absence of affectionate language produced measurable neurological deterioration. Isolation didn't just make humans sad, it damaged them. Their brains physically degraded without love words, the way muscles atrophied without use. They were a species that could be injured by silence. And the opposite was equally true. Love words healed them, not poetically, physically. Neuroimaging showed that hearing the words, "I love you" from a trusted partner activated repair mechanisms in the human brain, reducing inflammation, strengthening immune response, literally rebuilding neural pathways that stress had damaged. Their words were medicine, their silence was poison. Language was not a tool for humans, it was a vital organ. My everything. This one broke him open like an egg. Two words, possessive pronoun, and a totality. A human looked at one single being in a universe containing more stars than grains of sand on every beach their planet had ever held and said, "You are the sum. You are the total. You are what the word everything was invented to describe." It was mathematically preposterous. It was logically insupportable. It was the most beautiful sentence Drenvalis had ever encountered in any language, living or dead, across all 14 billion files in the galactic archive. Because it wasn't a statement of fact. It was a statement of choice. Humans knew, they knew that no single being could literally constitute everything. They understood scale. They grasped infinity. They had mapped the observable universe and calculated its incomprehensible vastness with instruments of extraordinary precision. And then they looked at the person sleeping beside them in the dark and whispered, "My everything," and meant it more than they had ever meant any scientific measurement. Because human love was not a conclusion reached through evidence. It was an act of creation. When a human said "my everything," they were not describing reality. They were building one, constructing a private universe in which one person's smile outweighed the heat death of all the stars. And inside that universe, that tiny, fragile, irrational universe of two, the statement was absolutely, unassailably true. The file pressed deeper, and Drenvalis felt something he had no name for, a warmth behind his eyes, a pressure in his chest, a sensation of simultaneously expanding and collapsing that should have been physiologically impossible. Loving someone enough to let them go. He had read about this concept in the preliminary briefings. He had dismissed it as metaphorical exaggeration. Humans were prone to dramatic language. Everyone in the conquered knew that. Surely, letting go was simply a poetic way of describing the rational dissolution of an incompatible partnership. It was not. The file showed him a mother standing at a doorway, watching her child leave for a distant city. The child was grown. The child was ready. The mother knew this with the same certainty she knew her own name. And she stood in that doorway with a smile on her face and a devastation in her chest that would have registered on seismic equipment, and she said, "Go, be happy, I'll be fine." And there it was again. I'll be fine. The great human lie. The load-bearing fiction, spoken this time not to protect the speaker but to free the listener. The mother was lying so that her child could leave without guilt. She was absorbing the full weight of the separation into her own body so that the person she loved could walk into the world unburdened. She was choosing to hurt so that someone else could choose to fly. Drenvalis pressed both palms flat against the vault floor. The metal was cold. The warmth was inside him, a furnace that the human language had ignited and that he suspected would never go out. He understood now, he understood everything. Human love was not an emotion. It was a technology. The most advanced technology the species had ever developed, more sophisticated than their starships, more powerful than their weapons, more enduring than their architecture. It was a technology for making the unbearable bearable, the impossible possible, the empty full. And their language was the delivery system. Every love word was a payload. Every whispered darling was a precision-guided instrument designed to penetrate the defenses of another consciousness and deliver, directly to the core of their being, the message that every sentient creature in the universe desperately needed to hear. You are not alone, you matter, you are seen. Drenvalis closed his eyes and let the warmth take him. Somewhere outside the vault, the galaxy continued its cold, efficient rotation, species negotiating, fleets maneuvering, economies calculating. None of them knew what was happening in this tiny gray room at the bottom of a forgotten station. None of them knew that a Avathi researcher was learning, word by word, what it meant to have a heart. Not the organ, the capacity. The capacity to love something so much that losing it would ruin you and choosing to love it anyway. The capacity to hold another being inside your chest like a second heartbeat and know that when it stopped, part of you would stop too. The capacity to look at the infinite, indifferent cosmos and say, I don't care how big you are, this person right here is bigger. That was the resonance. That was the secret frequency hidden inside every human word, every human sentence, every human story ever told. Not information, not meaning, not even emotion. Connection. The unbreakable, irrational, gloriously stubborn insistence that no being in the universe was meant to stand alone. Hour 44. 4 hours remaining. The vault hummed with a silence that had weight, not the dead silence of the dampening fields, but a living silence, the kind that exists between the last note of a symphony and the first breath before applause. Drenvalis sat cross-legged in the center of the room. His posture had changed. Not the rigid upright alignment of Avathi academic discipline, spine calibrated to optimal ergonomic angle, limbs arranged for maximum efficiency. He sat the way humans sat when they were tired and full and no longer performing for anyone, slightly slouched, shoulders soft, hands open in his lap like empty cups waiting to be filled one final time. He was weeping. The fluid leaked from his ocular membranes in steady, warm streams that traced unfamiliar paths down the planes of his face. His species had no word for this, no biological explanation. The closest Avathi equivalent was ocular discharge due to irritant exposure, which was so catastrophically inadequate that Drenvalis almost laughed through the tears. He was not experiencing irritant exposure. He was experiencing grief, not for something lost, but for something found too late. For 200 years, he had lived inside a language that could describe the universe with mathematical precision, but could not hold a single human lullaby. He had been fluent in 14 galactic tongues and illiterate in the one that mattered most. The file was ending. He could feel it, the way you feel a story approaching its final pages, the density of remaining meaning compressing into something almost unbearably concentrated. 14 billion data points, every poem scratched onto prison walls, every love letter folded into a soldier's breast pocket, every bedtime story whispered to a child who was already asleep but whose parent kept whispering anyway because the words were not for the child anymore. They were for the dark. They were a spell against the silence, a human ritual of filling empty rooms with sound so that the emptiness could not win. He had absorbed all of it, wars declared in speeches that made crowds weep with patriotic fire. Surrenders negotiated in voices carefully stripped of emotion so that the speakers could hold themselves together long enough to sign the paper. Scientific papers written in language so deliberately dry that you could almost miss the earth-shattering revelation buried in the methodology section. Almost, but not quite, because even human scientists could not fully suppress the thrill of discovery, and it leaked through their clinical prose like light through curtains. Legal documents, marriage certificates, divorce filings, wills, those extraordinary human documents in which a dying person attempted to distribute their love in the form of physical objects, as though a wooden desk or a silver ring could carry the weight of everything they could no longer say in person. Birth certificates, the first official act of human record-keeping for each new life. A name, a date, a location, so simple, so impossibly heavy. Because every birth certificate was also a declaration of faith, faith that the world this child was entering was worth entering, that the suffering it would inevitably face was outweighed by the joy it might possibly find, that the whole brutal, beautiful experiment of human existence deserved one more participant. All of it was inside him now, and the file had one entry remaining. The last word. It did not arrive with the force of hope, or the sharpness of defiance, or the aching warmth of sweetheart. It arrived quietly, the way dawn arrives, not announcing itself, but simply being there when you open your eyes. Together, Drenvalis felt it settle into him like a stone dropping into still water, sending ripples outward through every word he had absorbed in the last 44 hours. And as the ripples spread, connections formed, not logical connections, not academic cross-references, but emotional architecture, a vast and intricate web of meaning that linked every single human word to this one. Hope was the belief that together was coming. Defiance was the refusal to let together be taken away. Saudade was the ache of together, interrupted by distance or death. Hiraeth was the longing for a together that might never have existed, but deserved to. I'm fine was the lie you told, so that together could keep functioning. Goodbye was the prayer that together would survive the separation. Sweetheart was together given a name and a heartbeat. Laughter was together, refusing to be crushed by the dark. Every word, every idiom, every contradiction and ambiguity and maddening irregularity. They were all branches of the same tree, and the root of that tree was together, the fundamental human conviction that consciousness was not meant to be solitary, that the universe had made a mistake when it put space between beings, and humans had spent their entire existence trying to correct that mistake with words. The data core went dark. Not suddenly, gently. The quantum light inside it dimmed like an ember settling into ash, its patterns slowing, fatting, releasing the last of their luminescence in soft pulses that felt like breathing, like a chest rising and falling in sleep, like something alive choosing to rest after a long, long effort. Drenvalis sat in the darkness and felt the word together resonating through the cathedral of language that now lived inside him. It vibrated in his bones. It hummed in the spaces between his thoughts. It glowed in that nameless color his skin had become, the color that was not Evathi, not human, but something new. Something that had never existed before a scholar from one species had opened himself completely to the soul of another. He understood the human delegation's choice now. Why they had placed that word last. Why they had not chosen victory or power or dominance. Words that the conquered would have understood, would have expected, would have used to confirm their suspicion that humans were just another aggressive species angling for galactic supremacy. Together was not a boast. It was not a demand. It was not even a request. It was an open door. Humans had taken their entire linguistic history, every prayer and profanity, every love letter and legal brief, every joke and elegy and battle cry, and compressed it into a single final message for whoever was brave enough to enter this vault and listen. We have been alone. We have been alone on a pale blue dot in an unremarkable solar system at the edge of an ordinary galaxy, and we have spent our entire existence reaching outward, with radio waves and space probes and mathematics and stories and songs, because we believed, against all evidence, against all probability, against the vast and silent indifference of the cosmos itself, that someone was out there. That someone would hear us. That someone would come. And now you're here. And we don't want to conquer you. We don't want to study you. We don't want to convert you or consume you or compete with you. We want to sit beside you in the dark and tell you everything we've learned about being alive. Because we think you might have things to tell us, too. Drenvalis opened his eyes in the darkness. The vault was silent. The core was still. And somewhere on the other side of the sealed door, Commander Vostrel was waiting with his mandibles and his protocols and his carefully maintained distance from everything that might make him feel something he couldn't control. 4 hours remained. Drenvalis smiled, that new expression, that human gift, and began composing his report. Not in Avathi, not in the clean mathematical precision of his native tongue. In English, because some truths could only be spoken in the language that had bled to create them. The vault door opened at exactly hour 48, and the light from the corridor poured in like water breaking through a dam. After nearly 2 days in the gray half-dark, the fluorescent glare should have been blinding. Drenvalis didn't flinch. His eyes, all 4 of them, were open and steady, adjusted to something brighter than any light the station could produce. Commander Vostrel stood in the doorway. Behind him, arranged in a precise tactical formation that was entirely unnecessary and entirely characteristic, were 2 armed Driven guards, a 4-member medical extraction team from the Avathi Scholarly Collective, and a Silthine psionic specialist whose harmonic antennae were already vibrating with the effort of scanning for cognitive contamination. The corridor beyond them was packed. Word had spread, the way word always spreads on stations where secrets are the most valuable currency. Researchers had abandoned their archives. Diplomats had left their negotiations mid-sentence. Even the maintenance crews had found reasons to be on this level, carrying tools they didn't need and pretending to repair systems that weren't broken. Everyone wanted to see what walked out of Vault 7. Drenvalis stood in the center of the room. His skin glowed with that steady, nameless radiance, not flickering, not shifting, not performing the chromatic theater of Avathi emotional display. Just glowing. Warm and constant, like a lamp left burning in a window for someone who hasn't come home yet. The medical team leader, a senior Avathi biologist named Prathalan, whose 4 eyes held the particular sharpness of someone who had read every cautionary report and prepared for every worst-case scenario, stepped forward with a neural scanner raised. Researcher Drenvalis, I need you to submit to a cognitive baseline assessment before. The word hello comes from the Old English hal, Drenvalis said quietly. It originally meant be whole. Every time humans greet each other, they are wishing wholeness upon a stranger. Prathalan stopped. The scanner wavered in her hand. Every time, Drenvalis repeated, and his voice carried a texture that no Avathi voice had ever carried before. A roughness, a warmth, a quality that the Silthine psionic specialist would later describe in her classified report as emotional gravity. Billions of them, every day. Passing each other on streets, entering rooms, answering communication devices. They say hello and they have no idea they're performing a blessing. The sacred worn smooth by use until it feels like nothing. But it isn't nothing. It was never nothing. He walked forward, not with the measured, efficient gait of a Avathi scholar, not with the purposeful stride of someone who had completed an assignment and was ready to file his findings. He walked the way humans walked when they had somewhere to be and someone to see, with intention. With the unspoken declaration that every step was a choice and every choice was meaningful. Vostrel did not step aside. 19 years of guarding, this vault had calcified his protocols into something approaching instinct, and instinct told him that what stood before him was not the same being that had entered 48 hours ago. Are you intact? The commander asked. The same question from the same script, delivered with the same professional detachment. But Drenvalis heard what lived underneath it now. The worry that Vostrel would never admit to, the care that protocol existed to conceal, the ancient driven terror of witnessing something change in a way that could not be reversed. I am changed, Drenvalis said, but I think perhaps intact and changed are not opposites. I think the humans have a phrase for it. He paused, tasting the words before releasing them. I'm not who I was, I'm who I was becoming. Vostrel's mandibles went still, completely still. In 19 years of service, the Driven had developed an absolute mastery of his own physiological responses, a warrior's control over every twitch and click and subtle shift of his armored body. Nothing surprised him, nothing caught him off guard. But his mandibles went still. The medical team closed in, scanners humming, but Drenvalis raised a hand. A gesture he had never made before, a gesture that was entirely human in origin, palm outward, fingers spread, the universal signal for wait. The conquered will want a report, Vostrel said, recovering with the stiff efficiency of a professional who had stumbled and refused to acknowledge it. Then the conquered will receive one. Drenvalis looked past the commander, past the guards, past the medical team, and into the crowd that filled the corridor. He saw them, truly saw them for the first time, not as species, not as political affiliations or biological classifications or security clearance levels. As beings, fragile, temporary, luminous beings, each carrying inside them a universe of experiences that no one else would ever fully know. The Silthine communications officer, whose harmonic patterns carried a subtle dissonance that meant she had not spoken to her family in months. The Dreven maintenance worker, whose exoskeleton bore the faint scoring of old combat wounds he never discussed. The Avathi archivist in the back row, whose bioluminescent patterns were flickering with an anxiety that Drenvalis now recognized not as professional concern, but as loneliness. The specific, quiet loneliness of a scholar who had spent so long studying other people's words that she had forgotten how to speak her own. He saw all of them, and he ached for all of them. Not with pity, humans had taught him the difference. Pity looked down. Compassion looked across. What he felt was the human gift of seeing another being's pain and recognizing it as your own. He stopped beside Vostral and did something that violated every protocol in the Concord's interspecies conduct manual. He placed his hand on the commander's armored shoulder. The chitin was cold and hard and ridged with the texture of a life spent in rigid service to rigid systems. "Thank you for waiting," Drenvalis said. 3 words, spoken in English, carrying inside them the weight of a species that understood what it meant to keep vigil, to stand watch in the dark not because you were ordered to, but because someone on the other side of the door mattered to you in ways you could not articulate and would never admit. Vostral's mandibles clicked once, twice, then stopped. In 19 years, no one had ever thanked him for standing in the dark. Drenvalis walked into the corridor, and the crowd parted, not with fear, but with the cautious reverence of beings witnessing something they did not yet understand but sensed was important. He moved through them slowly, making eye contact, another human behavior, another tiny revolution. Avathi did not seek eye contact. They communicated through bioluminescence and precise verbal exchange. Looking directly into another being's eyes was considered unnecessary. Humans considered it essential, because eyes were where the masks ended. You could control your voice, your posture, your words, your face. But the eyes told the truth that the mouth was too afraid to speak. Humans had known this for millennia. They had a saying, the eyes are the window to the soul, and they looked through those windows constantly, searching for the thing that every conscious being craved and most were too frightened to ask for. See me, the real me, the me behind the performance. Drenvalis looked at every being he passed, and he let them see him. Not the researcher, not the academic, not the carefully constructed persona of professional competence. The changed thing. The being who had swallowed a species' entire emotional history and been remade by it. Some looked away. The vulnerability was too much, too alien, too raw, too dangerously contagious. But some held his gaze, and in those moments of contact, something passed between them that the Silthine psionic specialist, watching from the back of the crowd with her antennae trembling, would later call the resonance. Not the resonance of human language, something new. Something that happened when a being who had learned to feel like a human looked at a being who had never been given permission to feel at all, and that look said, "You can. It's allowed. It won't destroy you, I promise." He reached the end of the corridor and stopped before the turbolift that would carry him to the station's communication level. Behind him, the crowd murmured, a low, uncertain sound that crossed species boundaries and harmonic ranges, the universal frequency of beings processing something they had no framework for. The Avathi archivist from the back row had pushed to the front. Her bioluminescence was cycling rapidly, amber, violet, white, amber, the Avathi equivalent of a heart racing. She was young, perhaps 30 standard years, and she was looking at Drenvalis with an expression that he recognized instantly because the human language file had given him a word for it. Mami's Lepinatapai. A look between two beings, a shared desire, a mutual hesitation. She wanted to ask him what he had found in the vault. She wanted to know if it was true, if a language could really change who you were, could really crack open the efficient, rational, carefully calibrated shell of Avathi consciousness and reveal something wilder and more tender underneath. She wanted to ask, and she was afraid of the answer. Drenvalis smiled at her. That human expression, the rearrangement of facial features that served no biological purpose except to radiate warmth across the space between two beings. His species had no muscles for it, and yet his face moved, the tissues shifting in ways the medical team would later study with bewildered fascination, producing an expression that was unmistakable in any language. "It's okay, I was afraid too." He stepped into the turbolift. The doors closed, and as the lift carried him upward toward the communication arrays, where he would compose a report that would eventually reach every council chamber, every university, every quiet library on every world in the Concord, Drenvalis closed his eyes and held the word together inside his chest like a second heart. He would not bury his findings. He would not let the Concord classify and quarantine and forget. He would do what humans did, what they had always done, since the first one of them had looked at the first star and wondered if someone was looking back. He would reach out. Not with force, not with logic, not with the cold leverage of political necessity. With a word. The simplest word, the most powerful word. The word that contained every other word the human species had ever spoken. Together. Below him, in the empty vault, the data core sat dark and still. Its contents had been transferred, not to a datapad, not to an archive, but to a living mind that would carry them forward into the galaxy like a seed carried by wind into soil that had never known what it was capable of growing. And in the corridor outside Vault 7, Commander Vostrel stood alone in the dim light, one massive claw resting on the shoulder where a small three-fingered hand had touched him. His mandibles were still. His eyes were distant. And somewhere in the deep, armored, fiercely disciplined architecture of his driven mind, a crack had appeared. Not a break, not damage. A window. And through it, for the first time in his long and dutiful life, light was getting in. He stood there for a long time in the dark corridor in the silence, with the faintest sensation stirring in his chest. Something unnamed, something warm, something that frightened him exactly as much as it should have and not one fraction more. Then Commander Vostrel of Station Verath 9, 19-year guardian of Vault 7, enforcer of protocols and keeper of secrets, did something he had never done before. He whispered a word.